In Season 1 of Midnight, rogues were not brought to raids. Race to World First played no rogue on Lightblind and Vanguard, they played no rogue on Crown of the Cosmos, they played no rogue on Baloran. And it is definitely seen as an issue when a class is not played despite having a raid buff. Usually, Blizzard does not like when this happens. Hunters were not played in Avarice and they got Hunter's Mark as a result. DKs were not played in Undermine and every N boss needs multiple grips as a result. And Hunters were then, again, not played on Dementius, and Hunter's Mark is now arguably the strongest raid buff as a result. So, naturally, going into Season 2, we are getting increased numbers on the Rogue raid buff. Atrophic Poison was previously a raid-wide 3.6% damage reduction. It has been buffed to now be a 4.8% damage reduction, which you could say looks to be pretty big. Theoretically, this would be way better than Devo Aura. Unfortunately though, in reality, Atrophic Poison is still bad. The way Atrophic works is that it places a debuff on an enemy that reduces its damage done. The debuff in Season 2 will last 60 seconds, so its uptime is no longer an issue. You will have Atrophic up on every enemy that matters in most situations. But not all damage in an encounter comes from a targetable unit. On Valgor and Ezrak, 20% of all damage taken is this passive ticking damage that is sourced from Zarthath, who is just flying in the sky untargetable. On Crown of the Cosmos Phase 2, 27% of damage taken comes from untargetable silver simulacrums. So on some fights, Atrophic loses some of its value just because the damage comes from units that are not the boss. But even with the numbers that I just gave you, Atrophic wouldn't actually be that bad. It would be providing an adequate DR with the buff to 4.8% next season. Except that next season's raid is a lot worse in terms of the environmental damage that is present. Here is a sheet that someone made that shows what mechanics of the new raid will be reducible by Atrophic Poison. On Sizorak, which is the 5th boss, everything is reduced except for one mechanic called Ulatek's Presence. This ability is the main damage source of the fight. It appears to do 31% of the damage of the whole encounter, and Atrophic does not work on it. On Twin Fangs, which is the 6th boss, most of their abilities are reduced except for this one mechanic called Toxic Fumes, and Toxic Fumes appears to be doing about 40% of the damage of the whole encounter. On the Coiled Altar, the 7th boss, Coalescing Venom is not reduced, and that does 40% of the damage taken in Phase 1. The biggest offender is actually the Lost Explorers here, where Malevolent Presence, Splinters, and Relic Rupture are not sourced from the actual bosses, meaning 75% of the damage is not reducible by Atrophic. Atrophic does less than half the mitigation of Diva Aura on this boss. So it's pretty bad that all the later bosses in the raid have this massive environmental effect doing a large portion of the raid damage. But because Atrophic is now a 4.8% DR, it should still provide approximately 3% DR on bosses like Twin Fangs, where it only works on 60% of the damage taken. And 3% DR is a real raid buff. Nobody ever really drops Devotion Aura. Now if you look back at Dragonflight and the War Within, Rogue had the 3.6% DR version of Atrophic Poison, and it was played on every boss except for Styx, despite a lot of bosses still having environmental damage. So why, after 2 expansions, is Atrophic suddenly such an issue? And the reason is that Rogue kinda just sucks. The transition to Midnight has left Rogue as a class that has undesirable damage profiles, and there is not really any iteration being done to remedy that. Here is a sheet that collates logs of PTR raid testing, and on pretty much every boss, Subtlety and Assassination are among the bottom 5 specs. Now you could argue that this is just tuning. This is something that will be fixed when they tune the classes, and it's absolutely correct that we could get a patch any week now that increases the single target or just gives a flat percentage buff to any rogue spec. But single target is just one issue. A lot of these fights in the next raid are low target count cleave fights, think 2 target or 3 target, and the class is just fundamentally flawed on low target cleave. If you look at damage done to Lightblind and Vanguard right now, Rogue is occupying 3 of the bottom 4 specs. And a lot of this is because of the Midnight class design. Abilities and talents in the past that had value in cleave were reworked or removed, like Sub lost the majority of its nimble flurry damage, Outlaw lost precise cuts. So on any boss that focuses around 2 to 3 target cleave, Rogue will just fundamentally do low damage unless they are completely overtuned in other aspects. So if we take the example of the 6th boss in the next raid, Twin Fangs, it has the whole combo. It is a boss where Atrophic Poison has greatly reduced value. It is a pure 2 target boss, meaning Rogue will do low damage. So there is a quite likely chance that Rogue will not be worth playing on that boss, especially considering that Rogue is taking up a melee spot. And on the PTR logs that we were looking at earlier, there are Rogue specs that are literally doing half the damage of the top few specs of other classes on that boss. Rogue also appears to not be getting much iteration in this PTR cycle. Last Last week, we only saw some small aura buffs and buffs to talents that weren't being played. A few weeks ago, we actually saw an 8% nerf to sub-rogue, which kind of surprised everyone. Outlaw somehow is looking to be the strongest rogue spec in public raid testing logs, but that's kind of just bait. Outlaw has never been the raid spec for rogue in modern times. The last time it was played was the start of Dragonflight on Kurog, and it's kind of just a risk and a commitment to go and craft a weapon and gear towards Outlaw, especially because it's probably still a middle of the pack spec at best, and has a profile that is not typically desirable for raiding. Now, I can't go into the specifics of what the rogue kits actually need in this video because I don't really main rogue, but the summary is that despite Atrophic Poison recently being buffed, it will still provide less than 3% damage reduction on most fights in the new raid because of environmental damage. So the DPS that rogue does needs to be buffed significantly to be way better than it currently is if they want to counteract that.